Okay, where are we supposed to go now? Jake stared ahead. The cemetery fence was clearly visible through the darkness. And there was no path through it. He didn't mention the second copy of the map Aiden had left behind. He didn't want to. Because admitting that they'd made another copy felt like admitting something else. That maybe this wasn't safe. That maybe one day, someone might need that map to figure out where they had gone. The thought made his stomach tighten. It felt like tempting fate. But Jake told himself that was ridiculous. It was Halloween. It was dark. They were standing in a cemetery. Of course he was scared. Just wait. Aiden didn't slow down. He kept walking toward the fence as though he already knew exactly what was waiting for them. Jake followed reluctantly. When Aiden finally stopped, Jake nearly walked into him. He opened his mouth, ready to point out the obvious. They'd reached a dead end. There was nowhere to go. Then he looked closer. And stopped. There was a gap. Two sections of the old fence didn't quite meet. It was barely wide enough to notice. And behind it was a dirt path. A narrow trail disappeared into the woods beyond the cemetery, stretching away from the graveyard and cutting straight through the darkness. Jake swallowed. Aiden practically bounced on his feet. We found it. His voice was filled with excitement. Jake stared at the opening. Looks like we did. But there was no excitement in his voice. Because this wasn't a coincidence. The map had brought them here. Exactly here. To the one place where the fence opened. Jake tried to find a reasonable explanation. Of course there was a gap. The path looked old. Someone must have discovered it years ago. People could have used it during the day. There was nothing magical about that. Nothing supernatural. Nothing impossible. He repeated those thoughts silently. Again. And again. Because believing them was easier than considering the alternative. Aiden was already squeezing through the gap. His flashlight snapped on. Its beam cutting through the darkness. Jake cursed under his breath and hurried after him. He switched on his headlamp as he stepped onto the hidden trail. For a moment, neither boy spoke. The path stretched ahead of them. It was just wide enough for two people to walk side by side. The dirt was packed hard beneath their shoes, worn down by countless footsteps. So many. That Jake couldn't understand why he'd never heard anyone mention it. Tree roots pushed through the ground in twisted knots. Deep ruts cut across the trail. It wasn't dangerous enough to stop them. But dangerous enough that running would have been a terrible idea. Especially in the darkness. And then Jake looked up. The trees on either side had grown together overhead. Their branches twisted across the sky, forming a ceiling of leaves and tangled limbs. No moonlight reached the ground. No stars. Nothing. It felt as though the trees were deliberately hiding the path from the world above. As though they were ashamed of what lay beneath them. The two boys walked beneath that canopy. And the trail began to feel less like a road. And more like a tunnel. A tunnel with no walls. Jake glanced over his shoulder. He couldn't understand why no one ever talked about this place. A straight walking trail running through the woods on the eastern side of town should have been common knowledge. Sure, it ran alongside the main road. But it was still a shortcut. Someone had to use it. The evidence was everywhere.
The dirt was worn smooth beneath their feet. There were no weeds growing across the center. No thick brush had reclaimed the trail. Something, or someone, had been walking this path. Recently. Where do you think it goes? Jake's question was little more than a murmur. Aiden shot him an annoyed look. We already know where it goes. He pointed ahead. The other cemetery. Jake looked at the trail. Then at the map. Then back at the darkness ahead. Aiden sounded certain. But something about the angle of the path bothered him. It didn't look like it was leading south. Not anymore. Jake turned around. For a moment, he could still see the way they'd come. The faint outline of the cemetery was visible through the trees. But only barely. The farther they walked, the smaller it became. The darker the woods grew. Jake raised his flashlight toward the cemetery. The beam should have reached the gravestones. It should have illuminated the path behind them. It didn't. The light seemed to weaken almost immediately. As if the darkness itself were swallowing it. Jake slowly moved the beam from side to side. Nothing. Just blackness. Thick. Absolute. Hungry. It was almost as though the darkness wasn't simply surrounding them, but chewing through the light they carried. Jake shivered. He turned forward again. And without saying a word, he started walking faster. This place is creepy. Aiden's voice was quieter than usual. Jake glanced at him. For some reason, he felt a little better knowing he wasn't the only one thinking it. Then something moved. A sudden rustle came from the brush beside the trail. Both boys stopped. Instantly. Their feet froze against the dirt. Their flashlights snapped toward the sound. The bushes were still moving. Slowly. Something had disturbed them. But there was nothing there. No animal. No person. Nothing Jake could see. The leaves continued trembling for several seconds before finally becoming still. Jake swallowed. A cold sensation crawled up the back of his neck. He couldn't explain it. He simply felt watched. Not the vague feeling of being observed that people sometimes imagined in the dark. This was different. It felt as though something had been standing just beyond the reach of their lights. Waiting. Maybe. Jake forced the words out. Maybe we should walk a little faster. He immediately added. You know, so we still have time to go trick-or-treating when we get there. He tried to make it sound casual. Like that was the only reason he wanted to hurry. But inside, he had never been this afraid. And somehow, the worst part wasn't even the fear. It was knowing how stupid he was going to feel in the morning. He could already imagine himself telling this story at school. The cemetery. The dark woods. The moving bushes. He'd sound ridiculous. There would be nothing there. There had never been anything there. At least, that's what he desperately wanted to believe. Aiden nodded. Yeah. We don't want to waste all night and miss the candy. He started jogging. Jake followed. One step. Then another. And somehow, the jogging became running. Neither of them cared about the roots anymore. Or the ruts. Or the darkness. Or the fact that they could easily trip and break something. They simply ran. Faster. And faster. Until both boys were tearing down the cemetery run as quickly as their legs could carry them. The trail eventually climbed. Ahead of them stood a strange hill. It was perfectly round. Almost unnaturally round. The trees suddenly opened around its summit, exposing the boys to the moonlight. After the darkness beneath the canopy, the sight should have been beautiful. Instead, it was wrong. The moonlight was unnaturally pale, cold,